Okay, good evening, everyone. You're very welcome along to the first in the Irish Voices Global Perspective series from the Portershed. We're delighted to have you join us this evening for this session on user experience with Gerard Dolan, who's in Toronto. My name is John Breslin. I am from NUI Galway and also one of the co-founders of the Portershed. We're going to get started in just a minute. But what I'll ask as well is if you have any questions, we'll take them afterwards. You're welcome to enter any questions you might have in the chat or using the Q&A functionality, whichever you prefer. We'll take them from either. And with that, I'm just going to get straight into it. We're delighted to have Gerard Dolan join us this evening. Gerard is a user experience strategist who's based in Toronto in Canada. And I'll ask Gerard about his connections to Ireland later on. He has over 2 decades of design industry experience, and he's a very active voice in the user experience community. So thanks for joining us this evening, Gerard. We're delighted to have you join us virtually, as all these things are at the moment. And we might just get started if that's okay. And we have about an hour or so. I know we have a lot of questions that I have, and I've also got a few questions from others that I'll pose to you later on. But maybe you could just give us some background in terms of how you got started, I suppose, in the space, maybe ending up in the Ontario College of Art and Design. So tell us about your background, George.
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you very much. I really appreciate the invitation. It's quite an honor to be invited. We were chatting before, so kind of a bit of my family history. My parents immigrated to Canada in the 50s, and we were on the going home and 2-year plan that never quite worked out. And then basically we ended up in a part of Toronto where I was fortunate enough that there was a specialized high school there called C.W. Jeffries. And I do bring this up because it's quite a pivotal point in my life and my career. I ended up going to a Christian Brothers school here in Toronto, as you do, being an immigrant. And basically C.W. Jeffries was a local school that had the basics of fine art and design, but at a very early stage career. It was basically based off of the design school of the Bauhaus, and I was very, very fortunate. And if you track through a lot of very successful photographers, artists in the Canadian community, a lot of them actually came through C.W. Jeffries and then on the road to Ontario College of Art. It was a great primer to get there. In the Ontario College of Art, I was very, very lucky. There's basically the who's who of the Canadian design community, and it was an interesting time when I was going there, which was roughly 87 to 91. So we were transitioning out of basically the handcraft of design and branding and the golden age of the corporate communication years. And I was literally there in the last year when the first computer showed up. They were promptly stolen over the Christmas holidays, but nonetheless, I did get to touch one. I ended up buying my own, and I was at an interesting point of working with some of my design teachers who there was a European flavor there from the Basel and Swiss school, but also had the competing American Cranbrook group that was in there. And they were all computer-based, so I was getting the hand skills of typography and placa and literally hand drawing typography, and then going into the computer skills of mass production, which was quite helpful for the kickoff of going into that community. There's a lot of wayfinding in there, but and actually wayfinding is interesting. A lot of those core skills, such as wayfinding, signage systems, led to the system design thinking that really evolved into what now has become the user experience field.
And communication design, like how, I suppose, I know when people go to college, it's different in different countries. Sometimes people major or minor in different things. In Ireland, it's very much you kind of make your selection, and you have that, and that's kind of where you're stuck. So how what's the kind of route into, because obviously design is a related area to user experience, but there's obviously a kind of a route to get into that which differs from place to place. So how did you focus in on communication and design?
It was my interest, really. I was very fortunate, again, going back to C.W. Jeffries, where we did everything from 2-dimensional drawing, 3-dimensional drawing. We did sculpture. We built my own camera. We made our own paint. We made our own paintbrushes. It was those foundational items, those skills, those core skill sets. They left it open to us on how we wanted to apply it. But it did say to us that sooner or later, you're going to have to make a choice. And actually, it's a very pivotal point in, I would say, the Canadian design scene, which was, you used to be able to be I wanted to be a graphic designer who made album covers and painted them, right? I wanted to be the illustrator or the photographer as well. And back in those days, you could. That's not what you're able to do. I think that's a great thing, but I think it's a disadvantage to a lot of the students today, because they're forced into specialties so quickly that unless they're doing these basic skills on their own time, I'm not saying they won't ever get the skill set, but they're not going to be introduced to it in their particular field at their place of work. So I was very fortunate to have a very diverse group of teachers who all had wonderful backgrounds in everything from sculpture to painting. One of my teachers was the painter for the Royal Canadian Air Force. His brother actually painted all the Spitfires, all those War Museum paintings. Another one, he studied in the Vatican for restoring paintings. Another one, he was a photographer. Another one was a life sculpture teacher as well.
Okay.
So.
And when you finished college, what then? Like, what was your plan, I suppose, or did you know what was going to happen? I suppose because it's always scary when you finish your degree. And obviously everyone's getting jobs or thinking about getting jobs, or some people have no idea. But what did what was your plan, or what happened afterwards?
The plan was I was going to go to London and I was going to go get a job with Neville Brody or Pentagram. And I basically got on a plane, went over there and showed up. And it was the height of that cute little recession that happened in '91, which really pales in comparison to now. But it was a turning point in London at that time, because the design community started getting wiped out, especially from the computer, desktop revolution that was going on at the time. But on top of that, the recession that was happening. Promptly came home, started doing some freelancing, and quickly found a job at a small boutique agency, branding agency here. Learned a lot of good things, and I learned a lot of bad things in regards to what I wanted and what I didn't want, how I thought a design firm should work and how I thought it shouldn't work. Didn't feel and every time I've kind of made a change in my career when it comes to employment, usually the driving factor was I wasn't learning anything new, and I didn't feel that the skills that I was doing were actually going to benefit me and bring any value in my next stage. So,
and I know you obviously digital was kind of happening at that time when you were kind of doing your freelancing, and in the the web obviously kicked off in the in mid '90s. Was because I read that you kind of moved into digital in 1999. Is that because of the web, or when you say digital, do you mean like online?
Well, kind of what happened there. I mean, from '91 onwards, yes, all my work was being done on a computer, right? Yeah. And so started saying, no, I really felt the best way for me was to actually start my own firm. And I did not want to be working at one of the larger firms. They were not very happy places to be working, and the competition was pretty fierce to be that severely underpaid, to be honest with you, and working the hours that they were demanding. I didn't feel it was the type of work I wanted to do. So I had my own firm going, and I learned I thought a really good designer, but I found out I was a really horrible business person, and made all the classic mistakes. Got the big office, got the beautiful desks and everything else, and ended up having to take on work that I just didn't want to do. And I was doing packaging. And when you got a client who won't even invest in a fax machine, they're not going to talk to you about designing the website. And again, kind of went from they would ask me for a corporate identity and a brochure and those kinds of things. It moved to, that was a corporate identity and a website. But the clients that I had at the time were going back in time as far as I was concerned, and I needed a break. I had an opportunity that came on the table, which was to join a company called Rogers Communications, which is the largest Canadian communications company in Canada. And the deal was they had just gone through a rebranding. I was being brought into their digital department to handle all of the print work that had to be transposed over in exchange. I would be then trained on how to design websites. It was an incubator, it's a startup community. Learned a lot, had a lot of fun in 1 year. These were the heady days of the .com boom. So some of these coders would come in and not leave for 3 days and then just disappear for a week. And it was okay. And one just came in with orange hair on roller skates and hey, it's fine. There was beer on Thursdays, right? So I shut down my firm and then decided I wanted to go back freelance. And I joined Rogers at that time and stayed there for a year. And it was a year of education. It was really a really wonderful experience just to see, could you do it, and have a really good environment. It was a very positive environment. And actually that group of people, except for the last few years, since 99, we have gotten together for beers at least once a year. The original, like 100 people. So a really good group of people.
So you've kind of gone from obviously, being your own boss, freelancing, and then you took on various design leads roles with various firms about a dozen years ago, maybe the past, I guess, moving to that for a while over the past during the past 10 years or so.
Yeah. So again, kind of got more into design management, learned a lot about that, and then again another opportunity came up, which was to be a design lead with a Canadian design agency, which was working with one of the top financial banks in the world. Got to be a part of that team, and it was a really huge eye opener, going from the traditional branding world where you are the designer to you are in a design team of about 70 working on something. A lot of travel involved at that time, but it was very exciting work, and starting to get work augmenting another design team and being a part of the team where everyone's sitting in the same room at the same time, a room of 100 people talking through a problem. It was a really exciting experience. From there, took that as far as I could go, and part of it was the travel was really getting to too much. Just had a young child at that point, pressure to move to another city, which I just bought a house in Toronto. We then made the choice with my wife, who's Russian descent, that we are living in Toronto, and that is where we want to raise our child. And I took a job with McLaren McCann, which is now called McCann. It's part of the Canadian, the global agency. Started there and I taking the past skills of being a design lead, building teams, running a department. That became a director's role eventually, but it was those three different backgrounds that came together to build and refoster a UX team at McLaren McCann, which ended up becoming the first vice president there of that, and ended up becoming global lead on GM World. And again, really wonderful people, great opportunity. And then took that as far as I could go, and then made the jump over. There was a lot of reorgs going on, those kinds of things. Again, not really happy with the direction, just a bad fit, not learning anything else new. So went to one of Canada's largest financial groups and set up an entire department there in about a year and 9 months. Joined, there was about 6 people, and I ended up leaving the department there with about 24 full-time people. But across the spectrum, McLaren McCann, it was a creative department, so I was purely UX. At Investors Group, I was able to do everything, bring in a research team, build in the UX team, IAs, and then build in the visual design team, plus have the front-end development team also in the same group. So it was a huge opportunity, huge learning. So since then, I've gone back onto my own as being an independent consultant, contracting with several large financial firms, but also having the opportunity to work with some startups in the community and start to do some more thought leadership as well.
Okay, good. And we're going to come back to startups because obviously that's our bread and butter and something that a lot of people here today will want to hear about. So I was going to ask you that I a year or two ago, I can't remember who it was for, but some consultancy agency was doing basically kind of a survey of design in Ireland, and trying to figure out where we were in terms of courses and strategy and offerings and so on. And I'm not a design person, even though I like designing things. I've never done any design courses, but all I could think of was kind of design thinking and that kind of side of things, which I'll ask you about in a minute. But what I was going to ask you is a long about way of saying it is, what is design? What do you think it includes? And then I was going to just ask you, in terms of your own work, what aspect of design do you mostly work in? Is it interfaces? Is it ads? Is it apps? Is it anything at all? So what's design, and then where do you work within that?
Great questions. It was funny. Every time I go for a job interview, usually somebody asks me what's design.
That is
Um,
it.
design is problem solving. End of the day,
Okay.
right? Design is a very big word, and I mean there's a huge applications to it. And then we kind of get into the terminology of big D design versus little D design. And you know, a lot of the work that I do right now in service design or in agile thinking, agile methodologies as well, the people in this room with me may or may not be able to draw or code or write, but they're sitting there with me designing. And so the work that I do today is around that. A lot of it has to do with herding sheep, or sorry, herding cats. But those cats can be, I like to say, it could be people, but it also can be knowledge. And a lot of the times is we are trying to first, with the research, figure out what is the problem. And then second of all, find a solution that matches the problem of those people. So, well, I forget, a fellow by the name of Steph Gosbueller said it best. He says, like, design, in art, you solve your own problems. In design, you solve somebody else's problems. So it is a service-based industry, okay? So there's lots of methodologies out there. There's all different aspects, but design can come from so many different directions. And then, you know, there's going to be some questions later on about jobs and opportunities and things. It comes down to the job description. And I don't really pay a lot of credence into job titles anymore. They're quite frankly misnomers, whether it be from skill set and matching the skill set that's required to solve those problems, and or even requirements or salary, to be honest with
you. You know, I know you talked earlier on about, you know, being the designer and not being the business person. And I did a course, one of these executive programs in using this MIT methodology, and we're told about the hacker, the hustler, and the hipster. You know, the hacker is the techie or the engineer, the hustler is the business person, and the hipster is the designer. And I think this kind of holy trinity for startups, I think we often hear about the techie and we often hear about the business person in terms of startups, but perhaps the designer is often not mentioned as much, you know, but they are hugely important. I think there's become more of a realization that
you.
but when you think startup, you probably don't think of the designer maybe first of all. You know, how important are designers in companies, and you know, how can they best work with the business types and the technology types?
Yeah, it's a huge question and a very appropriate one. You know, we talk about the startup mentality. At the end of the day, nobody ever starts a company because they want a pretty interface. Nobody starts a company for any other reason. Usually the first slides in those startup decks is what is the user's problem? What is the problem you're trying to solve? And how relevant is it? Is it a problem worth solving? And then going from there. You know, the go-to always is immediately they're going to get some money and then they go get some engineering. And it's usually the satisfiers there are quant. You know, they're going to show numbers, they're going to show percentages, those kinds of things. I would say today more and more the questions from venture capitalists, and at least the things I've seen, the people I've talked to, is great. That's a problem, and we all know it's a problem in some cases. But what is the unique approach that you're going to do to fix that? And that's where design comes in, the differentiator. The challenge there is designers do a really crappy job at actually explaining themselves and or articulating what value they can bring to the room, and not talking in the same terminology such as adoption, efficiency, satisfaction, retention. I do a lot of work with the more junior students and team members, basically saying, great, what you just brought up is a very great idea about what we're doing with visual design, but now put it in some business terms that people understand outside this room. And that's what needs to happen. So with startups, I'm seeing more that they are going to design for the research to help verify from a qualitative and quantitative point of view of what the problem is they're trying to solve, and then showing unique presentation afterwards. I did some research a few years ago, and I won't get into the whole thing, but we were looking for the best place to buy items for a wedding. And from a features and functionality point of view, looking at some of the online websites were definitely the best places to go because they had all the features and functionality. But what they were lacking was a brand tone and an interface to allow people to engage appropriately. Technology-wise, they blew everybody out of the water, but nobody wanted to use it. So when I used these particular websites and actually showed it to people to say, would you go to a website like this to buy these personal items for your, you know, your wedding dress or anything else for a your wedding? They said no way in hell. Even though it would be cheaper, they said no way in hell because there was no brand tone. So user experience and design brings that proper tone, which then can be applied to the technologies and the features and the functionality. I think that's again the differentiator that's going to be helpful in any pitch deck.
Okay, cool. And you know, obviously how something looks is the, you know, as you say, it can be a differentiator. It can make or break kind of a startup when you're looking for something and you look at two things and you say, you know, I'm going to go with this one because it just looks so much better. I was recently asked by a US company to review a platform that they were looking at in terms of rolling out an online community or kind of an app-based community. And I just went to the website and I just, you know, I could see straight away there was issues in terms of how it was laid out and how it was designed. And I went to another one that just looked so much more professional. And even that kind of first impression can make such a difference. But then the other thing I suppose that you mentioned is, you know, design is solving problems, and design thinking, I suppose, as a methodology for solving problems or for empathizing with your users. Like I've seen you've done a course with IDEO, and I was, you know, really brushing up on all things IDEO for a while a couple of years ago when I was designing a university program. And design thinking is obviously a big kind of thing in the Stanford program. So actually we had Tom Kelly in Galway some years ago, and I managed to catch him for a minute afterwards. But anyway, just tell me about the importance of design thinking. Like, for those who don't know it, what is it and why it matters?
So it's a process. It is a methodology that is used to quickly identify pain points that, you know, moments that matter for basically who your target group is. The interesting thing about this, and if you look at the work that IDEO does, rarely do they have a client who calls them and says, I have a problem. They have a client who says, there's something going on here, and I need you to help me figure out what that is. So design thinking will lead to what is your problem. And it's very rare. I mean, there's other processes like lean UX. Design thinking leads into other processes such as human-centered design or lean UX, where you take the outputs of design thinking and then you can start to think it through even further and further and chop and block it up to then feed it into a process like Agile. So it's a very powerful process. It's very high level, which is great for large organizations because the different levels in the organizations, you're going to get very strategic thinkers, you're going to get very tactical thinkers, and you need both, right? So it's a very strong process. IDEO champions, obviously, as I mentioned, the B School, to get C-level executives to communicate and align on the challenges of their customers.
Okay. And then, like, experience mapping is something I saw on your LinkedIn profile, and, you know, I don't know anything about it. I suppose the name obviously indicates something in terms of how a user or customer, you know, interacts with something. But tell us maybe a bit about, because they're probably related, but design thinking I often kind of thought about as being, you know, a customer has a problem and you're trying to figure out what it is and how you can solve it. And obviously, as you mentioned, on the other side of that, you've got a company that, you know, has maybe a problem themselves or problems with their customers, whatever. But then the experience mapping sounds like it's kind of when something is already happening and you're trying to kind of figure out how somebody uses something. So are they kind of related, or are they separate parts in a user's, you know, interaction with your product, let's say?
They're definitely related. So design thinking can, you know, it's a series of exercises, and it's not there is a formal process for design thinking, but again, it depending on the money, resources, and the right culture, you're going to approach it differently. Experience mapping is a deliverable. It is a very strategic deliverable that can come out of a design thinking exercise that can then be actioned on. Okay, so when you think about the customer journey at a high level, you've got the pre, during, and post of any relationship. And what an experience map is a strategic exercise to identify, capture, and communicate the interactions of the multiple brand touch points over space and time. Sounds like a lot, but it is. And part of what you're doing here is identifying during the pre, during, and post, what is going on with your brand or what is going on with your customer in that journey. A proper experience map should be written from the point of view of the customer. Okay. I've had some interesting conversations with people as clients as you go through this. I had a client many years ago, and she's a lovely, very smart woman. But when we said, it was for an auto company, we said, certain pain points for people is to get an oil change. And she said, people don't get oil changes; they get regular service and maintenance on their automobile through their warranty. So their experience maps help people get out of the fishbowl a little bit and to understand the pain points and the moments that matter from the actual customer's point of view. It is a document that documents that. You are also tracking all of the existing touch points, all of those great ideas everybody shows up to every meeting with and fall off the table. You put those in there as opportunities, and it can be something that basically will inform your future roadmap and keep everybody aligned and keep everybody honest.
Okay, and that actually leads us right on to my next question about the fishbowl, because if you're inside or outside the fishbowl, you obviously have different expectations of what you're going to get. So if you're the company, you want one thing. If you're the customer, or the end user, I should say, because the company often is the customer, you want another thing. But before I do that, I want to give a short commercial break because I wanted to mention our next talk, if that's okay, Gerard, which is with Sean Lane. So Sean Lane is a Senior Vice President with Morgan Stanley, and he will be talking with Maurice O'Gorman from the Portishead about finance and many other things in our next session. So just a quick plug for that. I wanted to mention there'll be an email going out tomorrow about the talk with Sean Lane and Maurice O'Gorman, and you can sign up for that in our next session. But yeah, so inside the fishbowl or outside the fishbowl. So what I was going to say there is, when you're designing something for a company, they obviously are usually the people who are paying for something. And let's say it's the government. The governments are providing a website for services for citizens. The end user, of course, is going to be the citizen, and the government is the paying customer. So my question is, who do you design for first? Is it the paying customer or is it the end user? And what's been your experience in terms of problems there?
We'll keep it. We only got a half an hour left on this one, right? So, the end of the day, the client is the end user, period. Anybody who is within the organization is a stakeholder. And I've had some very charming discussions with several past colleagues and or clients. And what I like to call them is, the hippo, which is the highest paid opinion in the room. Okay. The end of the day, so I do a lot of work in finance, and working with different people in larger organizations are like, well, no, our sales team, that's who we got to make happy. The interesting thing is, once you go talk to the sales team, they're like, can you make my customer happy? Right. Yeah. It's about, again, the herding cats, and also the positioning and letting people talk and let them, if you get down to their hopes and fears, which is a great exercise, and if anyone's ever done that, we do that at the beginning of most meetings now. We get everyone to chart all their hopes and fears out of every exercise. At the end of the day, it's about control. It's about loss of power, especially when you do exercises like design thinking and you're putting in looking for the voice of the customer. Certain people can be threatened, right? So if we're designing timesheets for our employees, yes, they are the end customer, right? But if we are designing an app that is going to, and I'm using COVID times right now, I know we're going to talk about accessibility very shortly. If we're designing an app to allow people to get their government payments through COVID or to file their taxes in an appropriate manner, they are our end customer. I don't really care what, the wonderful thing about the design thinking processes or lean UX or agile is nobody's wrong. And we document everything everyone says, and then we put it on a sticky on a wall, and it's over here in the experience map of something we have to challenge. And it's a real challenge. We all feel that it's a priority that we need to tackle, and it's a problem we need to tackle. Or it's over here in the parking lot, which is, that's a really nice thing, and we'll deal with it another day.
Since you mentioned it, what is that behind you? Tell us about it.
So I was very fortunate. We moved into, we built a new home here in Toronto. We knocked our other one down and built a whole new one. It was cheaper. But my wife got the kitchen. I got the studio I always wanted. So I have white walls all the way around, and this is different things I'm working on. So right now I'm just going through documenting all the books that I moved 3 or 4 times in the last few years. And I should actually get around to reading and transcribing. So. Okay,
brilliant. So tell me, accessibility was something I'm one of the early web designers that did my kind of first websites around 1995, when accessibility was not even thought about. And of course, we've moved very much now towards seeing it being added into mainstream systems, like our social media systems are giving us options for making images more accessible. It's obviously becoming more and more prevalent, and not soon enough, and probably hasn't gone far enough yet. So what do you think about what needs to be done, or how are things going so far with accessibility?
Well, first of all, it's a huge topic, and it's a very, very important topic. Case in point, a few months ago, and all the stores were shut down here in Toronto, and it was the first day that you did curbside pickup. And as I mentioned, we were doing the house reno. I had to go pick up some things at the local, hardware store, big box hardware store. And I ran into a gentleman out front. He was like, why can't I go in the store? I go, well, it's shut down, COVID, right? And he's looking at me, he goes, what are you talking about? So he didn't have a smartphone. Mm-hmm. He said he doesn't have a cell number. He doesn't have an email address. And I was looking at this guy going, oh my God, you exist. This case scenario that they always said existed does really exist. So back to the accessibility, I kind of prefer the term inclusion, because accessibility is an issue, but there's a bigger, broader issue there as well. In Canada, we have one of the strictest, and to talk about accessibility, we have one of the strictest laws about accessibility, which is kind of supposed to kick in this year, where there's some severe penalties for websites and/or digital properties that are not accessible. And it really pertains to any company that has a headquarters in Toronto and has over 100 employees, basically has to have their website fully accessible. But the challenge there is, how do you make it stick? Some of the rules about accessibility, I mean, they just came out with a new update about a month ago or a few weeks ago. Most of the laws and the rules pertain to before the iPhone was even released. So there's some challenges there. The challenges also I have with accessibility is a lot of it is very code driven. If it passes through this particular piece of software, then it should be considered accessible. They don't take too much into consideration, they should, in regards to UX. So in the more success, no, those sounds like a lot of problems. The challenges are solved using good UX. And part of that is whether it's, if you're an agile, you may be familiar with the term of definition of done, which what we do is, while we're going through, even in the earlier stages in exploratory work, before we present anything or we start moving forward, it has to go through an accessibility review. And that includes a large team who, it's not a huge process. We literally get on a phone call for them, say every Thursday at a certain time, and show them some work and say, does anyone foresee a problem with this? From the coder's perspective, from the writing perspective, from the visual perspective. And we take that feedback and then incorporate it. Usually it works, sometimes it doesn't, and the proof gets ironed out over the process. So accessibility is a huge issue. The whole COVID thing has greatly amplified the problem. how do you support the people? Because at the end of the day, if people can't access banking or they can't access the government for support, you are basically treating them unfairly and not as, they're treating them as a second-class citizen at that point. So there's massive problems there.
Okay. Well, it's good to see that Canada are leading the way as well in some of those laws, because sometimes some other countries, as you know, can lag behind a little bit. I saw also on your LinkedIn profile that you're a fan of Dan Ariely, and I was fortunate enough to attend a course he gave in Google in Dublin some years back around behavioral economics and, understanding why people do things in a certain way and maybe how you push them to do things they weren't thinking of doing. There's obviously, a lot of power for adding more utility and more usefulness to systems, but you can also push users in an unexpected direction if you're unscrupulous or making people want to buy more than they perhaps otherwise intended. So what's your kind of your opinion? Is like, obviously you're familiar with Dan and his work.
Yeah, so that ties a lot into user experience and some of the conversations, topics you just brought up, which is not just about who the client is, but what is the problem we're trying to solve here, and that gets into behavioral and I will say into ethics as well. So kind of the goal is to have in a good UX experience is to have continuous research going on. So we're constantly validating and we are making sure that we are working on a problem that's worth solving. But we're also being operating an ethical standard. So, there is the cases out there, and one of them just popped up in the news again, because the trial for Elizabeth Holmes starts next month, which should be entertaining TV. If you've ever watched any of that or read up any of it, it's really crazy. That is like the extreme case of entrepreneur / psychopath. I don't know which one, pick one. And then, again, working in finance, a story that I'm following very closely is the Robinhood app, which is the investment app, which if people may not be aware, but there was a case last June. So Robinhood is a very aggressive investment app, which is taking gamification to another level and targeted young males in regards to, stock trading. A young gentleman last June sadly stepped in front of a train because he believed he's owed over $700,000 by poor investments, not realizing he was actually in demo mode. So to your question around behavioral economics, this is, I can't speak to senior executives who decide they want to run off into a field and go do something, but I do have a choice to be on the team that is making the decisions and actually pushing things live if I don't feel comfortable with it. So through the testing, my job is to raise red flags and say, hey, in the case of Robinhood, I'd like to believe that the design team actually had the opportunity, or are going to be given the opportunity in the future. If we see something that is very, very worrisome in a behavior or a misunderstanding of the communication being presented, that we have the ability to document it and then help solve that problem.
Tell me about your design or other heroes. And since we mentioned books earlier on there, you might give us some book tips as well. Your favorite, your must-have desert island books.
I was going to say, it's a little weird because, back in the early days when I was studying, again, designers, there was design awards, they won awards on their logos and everything else. And very little of the work that I do now is kind of represented in that manner. Because again, most of the work that I do is product work now, where there's a large team involved. So I usually bring it up with who is the people that I find that bring the most value. And I think to be a full stack designer is somebody who actually designs, but also learns, creates, and shares. So, so from a user experience point of view, some of the people that I've been following and who've made the biggest impact recently in my career has been the work of, from a research point of view, Leah Bewley. I think she's independent again now, but she's made some moves. She was with Forrester there for a while, and she was with Envision and also a couple other firms. Tomer Sharon, who's been doing some wonderful work and does some really great work on the side. He's working with, he's Goldman Sachs now, but on the side, he does a lot of workshops and he does a lot of online training, he does some really interesting, really actionable, thought-provoking kind of work. From a strategy and design perspective, Carrie Bodine, she does some work in experience mapping, similar field as myself. Jim Kalbeck, who's got a couple of books out on experience mapping, and he's a lot of fun at parties, by the way, really good guy. And then Nathan Curtis, I did a wonderful workshop with him going on about 3 or 4 years ago, where he's done a lot of wonderful work, and you can go on his Medium in regards to the design system. And he's got some really great exercises to help teams work through and break down problems. And then, you know, up and coming areas, I think anything on service design is a really good read. Then a thought leadership point of view, Jarrett Spool, obviously he's been up there for quite a long time. He's got some great online training video going on right now. Jeff Gothelt, highly recommend his book, Forever Employable, really good book. And just recently I had the pleasure of speaking with, but also got to go to a conference with Vivian Costello, who is doing some really interesting thought-provoking work in the areas of inclusive and equitable innovation for corporations.
And what I'm going to do is I'm going to paste those names into the chat for people, because I know that people always like to kind of have some, obviously there's many takeaways, but you know, some names of people to kind of follow up with. So I'm going to just paste that into the chat for our attendees as well. Teaching others. So why do you do it, and what do you do?
At the end of the day, great quote from Richard Feynman, which is, you know, if you want to master something, you need to teach it. So I was very fortunate, as I mentioned earlier in the call, that, you know, C.W. Jeffries, I had some phenomenal teachers who, you know, you left wondering, why are you teaching at high school? And they loved teaching, and they loved doing their work on the side. And I was very, very fortunate to have been their students. And then the same thing at the Ontario College of Art. The interesting, the Ontario College of Art, all the teachers there, one of the things that drove me to it, nobody could teach at the Ontario College of Art unless you were working in the profession, okay? So I do try and spend 80% of my time designing every day, which is, you know, gets tougher and tougher, as everyone knows, between meetings and everything. So the end of the day, I've been teaching on and off, and then about 2 or 3 years ago, a local accelerator, actually it's a global accelerator, I started working with them, and been very fortunate to teach over 400 students in the last 2.5 years. And what was really nice about this was because it's an accelerator, most of the people were from a professional background, so a little bit further on their career. They're coming back to upgrade their skills and or to learn something, because as they're sitting in rooms working with designers, they might have some imposter syndrome going on. They just want to know how to engage and communicate. And that was great. And the other side of this is I was able to test out my concepts and refine some basics that I have in my process, but also introduce new concepts and understand and play back from a very diverse group of people. Most classes were anywhere from 6 to 42 people. And then on top of that, you know, kind of my tribe, follow the misfits and find the misfits. I've always had a very strong relationship with schools in regards to finding interns and bringing them on board and then training them. It's very sad today that, especially in the corporate market, there's very little time for senior management to actually properly mentor, in my opinion. And the teams that, when I brought people on board, I've tried to do as much as possible. And, you know, in teaching, I learned just as much as the people in the class. So it's my wife says I come home happier at the end of the day, at the end of a class. So.
Because you're not just talking at people, then you're learning as well, which is great.
Yeah.
Do you have any tips for, you know, we've again a good few startup founders on the session today. Any tips in terms of user interface, user experience? Tell us what you think.
Yeah, I guess, you know, for anyone startup, you know, to understand this, and, you know, you don't need to be an expert at it, but you do need to understand the basics in order to engage the appropriate people. Is, you know, to understand the basic terms, and, you know, understanding that UX is not the same as UI. Again, there's a lot going on in this field, and the terminology and the acronyms can be dizzying at points. User experience, so kind of customer experience is everything across the board, which gets into anything that's digital, but also offline. Moving down to user experience generally is that the user's experience. So I talked about the pre, during, and post. User experience is really dealing with that during point of somebody engaging with a digital product usually. Service design can kind of go across the board. UI really gets into the visual application. So you kind of need a UX person or somebody with UX skills to deal with the ambiguity, to serve it up as a proper brief to bring in a UI person. So that's something I think people need to understand. That's not just how it looks, it's how it works. So careful and make sure you get the right skill sets on there. The other thing I can recommend just from a business point of view to start up people is be careful of giving away titles too quickly. I've grown departments from one person up to, as I mentioned, 26, 27 people. You don't want to be giving away VP titles, director titles too early. Those people who, I kind of find that there's a staging of 15 people, maybe 25, 30, and then 50, and then 70. Those people you bring in that 1 to 5 may not be the appropriate people. They may be very, very talented and very strong people in a small firm, but they're not going to be the people to lead a team of 25. And it's a different skill set. So I do recommend, if you look at, there's an agile chapters kind of model that's very popular right now, that Spotify kind of anchored and brought into the system, keeping things very flat and bestowing responsibilities onto people who can work their way into a job rather than just being handed it. And then the other thing, and just, kind of what we were talking about before, which is just making sure that you ingrain continuous research into your day-to-day practice. Somebody has to be responsible for that. And, that leads to innovation, making sure that you're carving out, that problem you identified a few months ago or a year ago, just even the COVID time right now. Are you sure that's the problem right now? And making sure continuous research does that, and kind of whole Amazon day one mentality of today is day one of your job, of your company, and keep it that spirit.
That's good advice. Future trends in this area, we've gone through so many iterations of science fiction, from Star Trek to Futurama, AR and VR, holograms, tactile interfaces. What do you see as being the kind of the things that I think people always ask this, don't they? What's the future going to be like? Tell us about the future. What are we going to be doing?
Well, I heard the joke, anyone who told us what their 5-year plan was 5 years ago was a liar, right? So would you believe you'd be sitting in your basement or, working in your main floor or your kitchen? At the end of the day, it comes down to whatever the research shows us. I'll bring this up. It's very, very humorous to me that I see voice recognition software is huge right now, right? I remember when I got out of school and I started my firm, I started interviewing, I grabbed a pile of annual reports, and I figured, great, I'll start talking to these companies. They got money, and they're going to be looking for something. And there was 5 companies in Toronto looking at doing voice recognition. And I went to interview with one of them, and they were like, great, we're a voice recognition company. I don't know why I need a visual designer, but you're here anyways. But they told me that it was the big thing 25, 30 years ago. But due to the technology, it actually couldn't become real until now, until the iPhone and then Wi-Fi and connections came through. So I'm not a really good person to judge on what is like the next technology. I mean, Bitcoin, I know there were some questions there about that. I don't like gambling, so I stay away from Bitcoin and those kinds of things. One of some things I can talk about, and again, that's the reason why I go back to the research. I was working with a company that had a lab in Montreal, and we had this big, day of, discovery, and letting the people in the room who were experts at this talk about it. And one fellow was talking about augmented reality, which is still another thing I don't get. I don't game. I've never been a gamer. And I said to this gentleman, can you give me 2 practical reasons why augmented reality should even exist other than playing games, right? And he told me about 2 things. He said the 2 things that it's taking off with are doing video conferencing. So, they put them on a deck in the middle of an ocean, and everyone's got their headphones on, and they're looking at each other, and they might be across the world. And this is all pre-COVID. So I think that area is probably going to take off. Yeah. The other thing he said was that doctors are using augmented reality to actually this was 2 years ago, are using it to communicate with people who have multiple personalities by assigning a different avatar to it. So when it comes to that stuff, again, go back to the research, find the people who are interested in this technology, and do the research and trying to connect the dots of the qualitative, which will tell you why the quant is actually working or what the problems are to solve. But I just brought it up, AI is going to be huge. It is huge. It is going to be continued. There's a wonderful book that Life 3.0. Do recommend that in regards to talking about AI. Anything with sound and audio, even COVID, going back to accessibility with our phones, the number of people now using voice recognition is spiked in the home and those kinds of things, especially with disabilities, those kinds of things. And then from an area of design that I think is huge is service design. And again, as I mentioned earlier, that kind of is a step above UX, which kind of goes across the redesigning services. And it's been going on talking about everything is turning into a service now, taking that, and not everything has to be digital because people may not need it digital. So service design kind of is a more strategic level of that. And then lastly, kind of to me, the three areas that are there to focus on industry-wise, finance for sure, education, and health. The last two, there's tons of problems to be solved there. The challenge I've always run into with those two is just whether they have the budget or not to actually solve the problems.
Particularly pertinent now in our current era. Gerard, thanks very much. We have 5 questions, and if more come along, we'll see how we are for time. But I think we probably might just take the 5 and finish with those. I'll start with the first one that I received through the Q&A system, which is from Amit Sharma. Hi, Gerard. How do you practice universal design, and does universal design exist?
I guess make clear what the term of universal design means. I mean, it can mean a lot of things. I'm going to take it into consideration that it's more of an all-encompassing kind of design. And I would say that leads to things such as service design, which you're talking about diverse group people in the room, not just from backgrounds, but also skill sets. That you're going to have a writer, you're going to have a technologist, you're going to have maybe even a philosopher. Depending on what you're trying to solve, you want to have that subject matter expert in the room who understands the business side of the things, the technology side of things, and the human aspect side of things.
Okay. Next question is, when starting out in a new startup as a UX lead, what's the first thing you should try and do to change their mentality to embrace more of the UX side instead of jumping into design and development? So how do you kind of change a startup's mentality to do more UX as opposed to just designing and developing stuff?
You need to show and not preach. I tried the preaching thing. It doesn't work. It really doesn't work.
Show how important it is, or show the difference between having good user experience and not, I suppose, is it?
Well, it's like anything else. You've got to start showing some small wins. There's a wonderful book that I highly recommend called The First 90 Days. It's a Harvard Business Review book. And before every full-time job I've ever had, I've read that book. It gives you a play-by-play breakdown on how to analyze your organization from a cultural point of view, figure out who are the long tails or the corporate historians in the room, and how to understand and communicate to that people in the room. You need to chop and block up your issues, show wins in the first 30 days, the first 60 days, and the first 90 days. That book really, really stresses is that you've got 90 days in your job to communicate and to get an alignment on how you are going to work with people and how they are going to work with you.
Okay, that's a good recommendation. From Shyam Panchal, any online course which you could suggest to sharpen fundamentals for user experience?
Yeah, well, I would say there's lots. There's a couple of books there, a question there also, just like top reads for UX. The two that I would stand out to me, and they're older books, but I think they're very highly relevant. One is the Polar Bear book, which was by Lou Rosenfeld. It's a Wiley book. It's basically called Information Architecture, but it's referred to as the Polar Bear book because there is a polar bear on the front. It's a very thick book. It'll give you a very in-depth overview of the majority of the work, the thought process of that. The book is about 10, 15 years old. There's another book by a gentleman by the name of Dan Brown called Communicating Design. Those are the older books that kind of get through that process. And just also thinking about, name escapes me right now, but I can definitely give you a list, John, and you can share it in the share it with the group afterwards. Or if anyone, please hit me up on LinkedIn. Happy to communicate with everyone.
Okay, so I think that covers those two: the online course and the Bible book that every designer should read. Yeah, we had another question from Gabe about cryptocurrencies and any advice, I suppose, for UX designers who want to increase their crypto literacy. I suppose, you know, like you mentioned various thought leaders and the names of thought leaders, and it's obviously kind of a hot topic at the moment, from, you know, governments to banks to
Tesla.
yeah, Tesla, yeah. So, and you know, I suppose should designers be thinking about cryptocurrency, and you know, if so, how?
Again, yeah, for sure. I mean, you need to understand what's going on in the field, but I mean, again, this is kind of a specialty. I mean, I'm in finance and fintech.
Yeah.
This is getting right into payments, right?
Yeah.
I kind of joke again. I'm not a gambler. You know, gold is legal. I don't accept it in payment for any of my projects. I won't accept cryptocurrency right now either. You know, there's a lot going on in that space. It's interesting. I just, to myself, it's at with the work that I'm doing, it's basically going to be another problem, which is, okay, this is going to come down the chute, and sooner or later, and they'll bring a subject matter expert in, or I will have to upgrade my skills on this to understand the problems associated with this payment system. And that's, and how would that be incorporated into the challenge of what we're trying to apply it to? So I think it's, you know, if that's a passion of yours, is that area, that's definitely a specialty in the area within finance that a person could study. But then from there, what do you apply it to? Is it working for a company that has the platform that, you know, works with cryptocurrency? Or is it taking cryptocurrency and applying it to the automotive industry if you're going to work for a company who's going to accept it for online payments, those kinds of things? To me, that's the connection there.
Okay. Two more questions. One is from a person new to design. They have seen a number of companies hiring UX roles in Galway in the past 6 months. And I suppose this is always a question. It's like kind of the cold start thing. You know, how can a graduate build up a meaningful body of work to target junior product focused roles or design internships? So how do you get going? How do you kind of get that, you know, body of work that, you know, you leverage, I suppose, to get that job?
Yeah. Well, again, it, you know, depends on your background. If you've come up through, you know, having a design background or something related to design background, you know, there's a way to move forward. The good thing about where we're at with UX or even service design is any kind of background in some sort of field, again, finance, education, or health, is good domain knowledge that you can then build upon. So in UX, you know, the tough thing is, you know, it used to be within 30 days or 90 days, rather, you would see some return from a designer bringing them on board. Now it's up to like 6 months. And part of the reason for that is there's the design skills that you need to have, but then you need to understand the business as well. So one of the things I tell my students is don't throw away your past. Look at augmenting your past to go into that. John, you there?
Sure. We can hear you loud and clear.
What's that?
We can hear you. Can you hear me?
I can hear you, yes.
That's perfect. So I think John is just trying to reconnect right now.
Okay.
Second.
Worries.
Okay, so John is having some Wi-Fi issues. I don't think he's able to reconnect.
Okay. I'll just finish off that last question. But I'm not sure, I hopefully heard the first part of it, but basically, you know, tell students that not to throw away your past, and you can build upon that. At the end of the day, there's a really good book I can recommend. It's got a really horrible title. It's called It's Your Move. And the book is, again, it's about how to make a career transition. But one of the important rules in this book is you start collecting job descriptions. And what you want to do is pick 2 or 3 that are your North Star. And then you start figuring out, looking at your resume, what is missing from your resume to connect to those job descriptions. And you want to start picking companies that have a suitable connection to your past, and or a not too significant of a jump, but enough for you to make it. What I mean by that, I mean, if you're in a very senior role and you want to move over into design, you're going to have to accept the fact that you might have to take a bump, whether it be in title and in salary, but there's ways around that. If you're more junior and, you know, you want to, you know, within your, you know, stage of your career, there's opportunity to move over there. And or like I mentioned before, with my joining Rogers, I didn't have the digital background, but I had other skill sets that team needed. It was the right partnership to make me bridge that gap. So I hope that answers the question.
That's brilliant, Gerard. I think we've gone through all the questions and we've just gone over time. But Gerard, I'd just like to say thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, thank you.
Something from this webinar, and to everyone who attended, thank you so much. We'll send everyone out a link to watch the video again tomorrow, and we may upload it on YouTube to watch again.
Yeah,
Gerard, thank you so much.
Thank you, and please reach out on LinkedIn, and all the best. And again, thank you very much. It was very enjoyable. I appreciate the opportunity to speak to everyone.
That's great, Gerard. Thank you.
Take care. Bye-bye.